Hello, welcome to a presentation. We're going to be talking today about scientific method. And so we'll go ahead and we'll just get started on this. The scientific method we talked about previously is a way of looking at a problem or something that we're trying to figure out and applying through a select steps to come to a good concrete conclusion. The reason we use the scientific method is it kind of gives us a framework. We talked about previously how to ask good questions, how to get good answers, and look for things in that area. And so the scientific method has been developed over a period of time, and it's not always clearly is laid out as it is right here in this picture. Sometimes there are some things you can and can't do depending on the type of question that you're asking, the type of study that you're looking at. But this is generally the accepted flow of how it goes. You ask a question, you do some background research, you construct a hypothesis, you test your hypothesis by doing an experiment, and then from the experimental results, you analyze in your data, draw a conclusion, and then look to see if this was close to your original hypothesis, your original question, and then you repeat it. You do it several times just to make sure that it's not a mistake, a fluke, and try to get a better answer every time. So again, here's another picture of the scientific method, and it shows down here at the bottom where the hypothesis was supported or not supported. You kind of go, and depending on what happens, you state the problem, you get information, you form a hypothesis, test it, analyze the data, draw conclusions. If it's supported, you just test it again a couple times to make sure that you're correct. And other people will also test it as we go through and look at some different things, some of the major discoveries in that talks about a lot about how people tested it and found out whether it was true or not. And if it's not true, then they change their hypothesis and they try again. Here's some terms that we need to talk about that will really kind of help us understand what's going on. Please pay attention, take notes on these because they are going to be quiz questions. So the first one is variable. What is a variable? It's the part of the experiment that changes or is being tested, right? And there are two types of variables. The word variable actually means changing, okay? So the first one we talk about is the independent variable. This is something that's changed by the scientist. I always remember the independent variable is because I, with the I, am independent. I'm the one changing the things in the experiment, okay? The independent variable is the one that's changing because I changed it. So it's also being what's tested or changed on purpose. All right, we'll do some different examples later on after we get done these terms to kind of help flesh all this out for you guys. The next variable we talk about is the dependent variable. This is something that might be affected by the change of the independent variable. If you change, you want to see how caffeine can affect how awake you feel. All right, so I changed from 1 cup of coffee to 2 cups of coffee. That is the independent variable because I changed how many cups of coffee you're getting. The dependent variable would then be whether or not you feel more awake, depending on how many cups of coffee you've got. All right, so the dependent depends on the independent variable. That's why I keep those two straight. Okay. Again, here it is, depends on the independent variable. The dependent variable is also what is observed or measured. This is the result of the experiment. This is what we're checking to see whether or not our hypothesis is correct, what the change did. Okay. How many variables should you test at one time? Should you have should test the difference between coffee, Coke, Mountain Dew, and then how many cups of each that we get, determine how awake you feel? Well, all the results would be really mixed up. So you only want to do one variable at a time. So again, if I'm saying I'm using Miracle-Gro potting soil will make your plants grow taller, but I change how much water I give the plant, how will I know if that was the soil or the extra water that made it grow taller? Okay, so we always want to test one variable at a time if possible. And the last term we're looking at is the control. The control is the part of the experiment that stays the same. That would be the same amount of water, the same amount of sunlight, the same amount of cup that you drink, whether it's Mountain Dew, Coke, or coffee. All right, so it would be the same amount. Okay, so that's the controls. So those are three terms you really want to make sure you get down in your notes and pay attention to those, and also know the variables. Testing at one time, you should just test one variable if at all possible. Sometimes it's not possible, and we'll get into that later on. So here's an example that we can look at. All right, It says Mr. Herder wants to know if using fertilizer actually increases plant growth. I've read in a few articles that mention the benefits of fertilizer, and some say that it doesn't work well on some plants. I personally think that using fertilizer is a waste of money and don't think that using fertilizer will have any effect on the plant growth, but he wants to find out for himself. So I developed an experiment to find out. So this is information that you'll get sometimes in the tests and different things that you'll get through like the ACT and SATs will actually give you a block like this, and then you need to pull out the information. So the first thing we need to do is state the problem. What am I actually looking for? What am I testing in here? All right. So and then after I state the problem, I need to gather the information. Okay. Did I actually go in here and gather information on it? I did. I read a few articles. Okay. The problem is that I want to know if fertilizer increases plant growth. I gather information. All right, I made a hypothesis. My hypothesis, if you look in here, says that fertilizer does not work. That's my hypothesis. Okay. So here's my experiment that I did. All right, so notice I brought one package of sunflower seeds. So it's all the same seed. Right, that's a control. There's 6 identical pots and 1 large bag of the same potting soil. So these are all controls that I have. All right, I planted 1 seed in each of the 6 pots and gave them all equal amounts of potting soil. 3 of the plants were given fertilizer. All were watered the same for 1 month. Now here are my results, and I put a table on the right-hand side over here. Okay, so notice that the plants, all right, I'll move my picture down here so you can see it. Plants 1, 2, and 3, all right, versus with no fertilizer, and they can average those out. The fertilizer, they grew taller. So just at a glance, you can tell that fertilizer grew more. Okay, so again, what are my independent variables? All right, the independent variables are what did I change? Right, I changed the fertilizer. Very good. Okay, the dependent variables, what was the result of me changing the fertilizer? No fertilizer versus fertilizer. The result is fertilizer grew more. Okay, and what can you conclude from the experiment? Well, obviously, looking at the data table here, you can conclude that fertilizer actually does make this particular plant grow taller, and we use sunflowers. All right, here's some examples we can run through really quickly just to kind of get you practice at looking at the independent, dependent variables and the controls. So students of different ages were given the same jigsaw puzzle to put together. They were timed to see how long it took to finish the puzzle. What is the independent variable here? What is the dependent variable? And what is the control? Always look for the word like same. That usually gives it away what the control is. There's your hint. All right, so the independent variable this time was the age of the students. All right, I controlled students of different ages. All right, the dependent variable was the time. How long did it take to finish the puzzle? Obviously, you would think the older student is, the easier it would be for them to put a puzzle together. And the control itself was the same puzzle. Okay, so there's a few keywords you can look for to find your controls, or just think about how the experiment was done. And there's other controls too. A control could be the room they were in. If I did a noisy room versus a quiet room, depending on what was going on outside at the time, if a PE class was running outside, that would be more distracting, so that wouldn't be a good control. So I want to make sure everything is exactly the same as much as possible that I can control. Here's another example. The higher the temperature of water, the faster an egg will boil. Well, you may say, Mr. Herder, there's not enough information here. But there is. Okay? The independent variable, what do I control? And what do I change? Right, do I change the speed the egg will boil in? No. All right. Dependent variable, what is the result of what I changed? Okay. And the control. So independent variable would be the temperature of the water. I controlled how hot the water is. All right. The dependent variable would be how long it took to boil the egg. Okay. And the control would be the type of egg. Obviously, if I had a chicken egg versus an ostrich egg, the ostrich egg would take much longer to boil. Also, you could say the water. If you really want to get specific, certain types of water can boil and retain heat more or less. And we'll get into that much later in the year and talk about how to make hot water hotter. A thermometer. Here's one. A thermometer is used to measure the temperature of water at different depths of the pond. Again, what is our independent variable? What do I control? What do I change? What is the dependent variable? What is the result of what I changed? And what is the control? Again, the independent variable would be the depth of water that I take the temperature reading at. The dependent variable, depending on how deep the water is, would determine what the temperature changes. Typically speaking, the deeper you get in water, the cooler it becomes. Right? And also control. Thermometer uses the same type of thermometer or uses the same pond as well. This is why in a hot day, if you want to go fishing and catch fish, you need to go deep into the water because that's where the fish are, where it's cool. Okay? All right, and one of the last things we're going to talk about here about doing an experiment and using the scientific methods, you need to be objective. What does being objective mean? Being objective means I'm not showing any favoritism. Okay, it means not showing favoritism. That's objective. And then a lot of times in social studies in different places, they'll talk about how you have good news and bad news and junk science and all that kind of stuff. And objectivity means you're going to take yourself out of the equation and you're just going to report what you see, report what's there. And unfortunately, in our day and time, that doesn't happen too much anymore. So objectivity is essential in science. I may want a certain result to happen, but I got to make sure that when I do the experiment that bias doesn't show up to make the difference in the experiment. Being subjective means you show favoritism. Okay, here's an example. Bias again. Forgot that was in there. Bias is another word that means showing favoritism. Okay, so let's say I don't like my neighbor's mean snarling pit bull, and I want to get owning a pit bull outlawed in Box Elder. I go get the mayor and show him my neighbor's mean pit bull. Am I being objective or subjective? Well, I'm being very subjective because I'm showing the mayor a very bad example of a pit bull. I happen to have some really great pit bulls. I am not against pit bulls by any means. I just use this as an example to show that you can be biased and how that will affect the outcome. If I show the mayor 5 different dogs and 1 out of the 5 is snarling and mean, he's likely to say, well, it's not really a big deal because it's just 1 bad dog out of 5. Okay. So think of a situation where there could be bias in science or research studies. Think about COVID-19. Some companies might really want to have the cure. They want to be the first one there. They might think that doing something will be beneficial to curing COVID, so they're going to put that in their experiment, but it's not because they're being biased. Okay. One of the things we have to do is ask good questions. That's essential to get good answers. So oftentimes we want to ask questions that are difficult to truly measure or test. Is Coke better soda than Pepsi? How do you measure that? Okay, so there's a better way to say that. Is Metallica the best rock and roll group of all time? Well, what do you mean all time? What do you mean rock and roll? I mean, there's a lot of different variables in here. So we want to ask a good question using the same ideas, and here's what it can look like. So we're going to frame the question in a way that it can be tested. So what is the preferred soda of Douglas High School students? So that's why we can say, well, Coke is more preferred than Pepsi. So it's a preference. It's not, does it taste better? Does it give you more energy? Now, those are all more specific questions that we could actually test. Okay, so try to avoid broad questions when you're coming up with an experiment or designing a question to be tested. You want to be very specific as much as possible. For instance, what percentage of eighth period biology believe that Metallica is the best rock and roll group of all time? Now, I took that and framed it in a much more measurable type of scenario. Okay. So let's apply all that we just went through. Let's apply what we know. So, for instance, if we wanted to find out if there's a difference between bottled water and tap water, is there a way we could test it? What do you guys think? Just think about it for a little bit. And with the person at your table, come up with a measurable question that we could ask and a way we could test it. Obviously, if you're sitting in my class, you're going to do this together, but take this question, think about it, mull it over, and ask, bounce it off of somebody sitting next to you, and it may pop up later on. All right,